Hey guys, Will here. So deciphering modern day sim racing technology when it comes to direct drive wheelbases has become very complicated in the last couple of years. When we started doing these videos many years ago now, there was only a couple of different choices when it came to sort of consumer grade technology. And these days, there are so many brands doing so many different things. There's all kinds of buzzwords floating around like full force, true force, telemetry based force, feedback, LFE, all kinds of things. And it's just basically getting really difficult to understand. So what we're gonna be doing in today's video is breaking down the technology and letting you guys know all the things that you need to know about direct drive wheelbase technology in order to make an informed decision when it comes to choosing what's gonna be best for your specific needs. So what you can see beside me and behind me here is just a small collection, probably less than 20% of the wheelbases that we have here in the Boosted Media studio. And we are constantly retesting, checking new firmware, doing all kinds of things to make sure that we're always trying to keep on top of stuff and give you the most recent information. But a video is only ever really a snapshot in time. So what we've done is we put a ton of effort into our direct drive buyer's guide on our website, boostedmedia.net. So of course, we will still continue to review new wheelbases when they come out. That's not going to change. But what we're going to be doing is referencing that direct drive buyer's guide a lot more. That's going to serve as somewhat of a quick reference guide for you guys to understand what we believe to be the best value for money based on our testing, as well as a quick breakdown of each of the brands, what their strengths and weaknesses are, some of the unique things that they might offer. So I'll drop a link down in the description box and in a pinned comment down below this. But if you just want to quickly jump on there now, I'll just quickly run you through a couple of really important things. So you can see when you load up the page that we have a basic chart here, and this is essentially a value for money scale. So at the top, you'll find the bases that we believe provide the best value for money, and then down towards the bottom will be the least value for money. So we only include bases that we've actually tested ourselves on this chart, which is why there may be a few things missing. We will of course be keeping this updated every single time we release a new product review. So you might be thinking, well, hang on, I've heard that the Simucube 2 Ultimate is the best wheelbase ever made. Why is it at the bottom of the list? Because it's not necessarily good value for money, even though it is a very good wheelbase. So that's the way we've presented this. Now, the other thing I want to let you know about this chart is if you click on each individual model, up the top of the page, you'll then see the brand, the model, the price, the advertised torque of the wheelbase, a price per Newton meter comparison, and then on the right-hand side, our subjective scores based on our testing. So force feedback quality, build quality, software, ecosystem, and then overall value for money. So you can click through any of the bases on this chart and it will give you that breakdown. You'll then notice we also have a button there to click through to our full written review and video review of each individual product on the chart, as well as links to purchase each product through our affiliate network if that's something that you ultimately decide you want to do. And as you guys know, that is an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media without it costing you an extra cent. And that is what keeps us running and able to do these things. So yeah, we really appreciate your support there, of course, as well. So this is just one part of our exciting new website we've just recently launched, and I will be doing a separate video very soon taking you through all the details of that too, because we are extremely excited about what we've been able to achieve there. So if you scroll down from there, you then also have a breakdown, as I was mentioning before, of each brand, pros and cons, and you can also click on the little buttons for each brand here to jump directly to that particular brand for more details as well. So hopefully this can become a really powerful tool for you guys to get a quick snapshot of exactly where things are in the market at any point in time, because we will be keeping this regularly updated. But back to the point of today's video, and that is to give you a better understanding of exactly what all these buzzwords and technologies are all about and what you actually need to know to make an informed decision. So we're going to be starting off today with the basics, talking about things like how much strength do you actually need, what is dynamic range, what is clipping, things like that that are kind of fundamental knowledge. And then we're going to get into the weeds a little bit more on some of the more highly technical things like slew rate and some new technologies like telemetry, force feedback, LFE, and so forth. So I've dropped some timestamps down below. If there is a particular thing that you are wanting to learn about, that's going to be a great way to quickly get that information. But I would recommend, if you do have the time, try to watch through the entire video, because it will give you a much better overall picture of exactly what means what and what you need to pay attention to. So let's start off here with what is probably the most commonly misunderstood question and topic of probably hottest debate amongst sim racers. How much strength do you actually need in a wheelbase? So although there is some subjectivity here, the answer is actually pretty straightforward. Ultimately, all you need is enough dynamic range to produce the forces necessary to communicate what the car is doing underneath you in a manner that doesn't require explosive muscle input and doesn't result in clipping or compressing the weaker forces. Now, obviously, everybody is built different, so where the sweet spot sits for you isn't going to be exactly the same same as everybody else. But for most adults, in my opinion, this is going to fall somewhere between about 10 Newton meters and 14 Newton meters of constant force. Now, that's not to say that you need to rush out and buy a wheelbase that falls within that 10 to 14 Newton meter range. A 5 Newton meter wheelbase is going to be absolutely fine. A 6, 7, 8, 9, anywhere up to 10 is going to be absolutely fine as well. What I mean by that is that is the sweet spot. So that's the point where most people are probably going to find they're never going to feel compelled to upgrade again, because that wheelbase is giving them all the strength that they could ever need. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with a wheelbase that's weaker than that. It's just that that's where the sweet spot sits. Now, of course, if you are looking at buying something for a younger kid, I wouldn't actually recommend anything over about 5 Newton meters for anybody under about 12 years of age, unless they happen to be really strong, or maybe they're used to, real life karting or racing or something like that. That is going to provide more than enough strength for a small child. And, you guys might have seen many years ago, I actually broke my thumb running I think it was about 12 or maybe 14 Newton meters of peak torque on my SimiCube 2 Ultimate. So these things, even at the entry level, are absolutely not toys. They are serious pieces of equipment that do have serious potential to injure you. And one of the bugbears that I have with a lot of these products that we're testing these days is a lot of them don't come with emergency stop buttons. And I really do think that is something that needs to be better regulated. So even on the highest of high-end bases that I've run on my daily driver rig over the years, I've always kept my maximum dynamic range, or my maximum force, capped somewhere around the sort of 16 Newton meter mark at peak, to allow a little bit of headroom for clipping, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I've always found that gives enough dynamic range to produce all of the effects at the strengths that is necessary to communicate what the car's doing, as I was saying before, accurately, and allowing you to drive consistently, which is of course why we're all here. So just to put that in perspective as well, we've often heard talk about how much force is actually present in a real car. Now, it's a bit of an awkward argument here, because different types of cars obviously have wildly different amounts of strength. There is no limit to the amount of strength that can be transmitted through the steering rack of a car if you're in an accident. You can imagine if you hit a wall and the wheel gets pushed back, that's going to send a massive jolt through the steering, at least if you're running a conventional steering system and not an electronic steering system. And that could put an absolutely massive amount of force through the steering. But look, for most street cars, equivalent of about sort of, 7 maybe to 10 Newton meters of strength will have you covered. If you're talking about something like an Indy car, for example, then those can actually output up to, in the 30 Newton meter range of strength through the wheel. But, most of us aren't built like professional athletes. Those guys have necks as thick as my torso, arms as big as my legs. So yeah, most people will be absolutely fine with somewhere around 15 Newton meters of strength, and they shouldn't ever feel any desire to upgrade for anything other than just fear of missing out, to be honest. There's always going to be marketing trying to convince you that you need some crazy high-end 30 Newton meter plus wheelbase. And look, brands are very clever at, packaging certain features only with their higher end wheelbases to try and entice you into a more powerful base. But if they just put those features in the more entry level stuff, nobody would ever need anything more than that. So that's a little bit of a bugbear that I have with the market and some of the manufacturers in general. But yeah, at the end of the day, in my opinion at least, nobody needs more than about 15, 16 Newton meters at absolute most. And you really shouldn't have any desire to upgrade after that. The only real reason I can think of that anybody would actually feel the need to upgrade is simply through FOMO, or fear of missing out. People think that they're going to get something more than what they already have if they take another step up. And look, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, that's just simply not going to be the case. But if you are just wanting to dip your toes in and not quite sure whether sim racing is for you, don't get sucked into thinking that you need something absolutely crazy. Something around that 5 to 10 Newton meter range is going to be absolutely fine. It's going to give you a great experience. You just may find that a little bit later on down the track, you do decide that you want to upgrade. So hopefully that made sense. I did use a couple of buzzwords in there like dynamic range and clipping. So what exactly is meant by those terms? So dynamic range is quite simply just the range of force the wheelbase is able to produce between nothing and its maximum available torque. So you can think of it kind of like an audio system. The more you can turn up the volume before you start to get distortion through the speakers, the more dynamic range you have available. So what does that actually mean for the driving experience? The more dynamic range you have, the wider the strength levels that you'll actually be able to experience through the steering. So the more accurately it can reproduce the sensations that you would actually feel through the steering wheel of a real car, from tiny details like road texture all the way through to curbs, sustained cornering forces, and of course impacts like we were talking about before. But there is a range of usefulness before you start to get into the territory of just pure diminishing returns like what we were discussing before. So we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. So yeah, to summarize there, having enough dynamic range is important, but only to a point. That sweet spot being about 10, 15 Newton meters like I was talking about before. Anything beyond that does just become complete overkill. And as you'll understand a little bit later on, having the capacity to go far beyond that sweet spot can actually be detrimental in some ways, because it does require things like larger motors, and larger motors will tend to have more rotating mass, larger magnets, larger coils, and so forth to handle those high torques that you may not actually necessarily need. And one of the things that's really important to understand is, just like an audio system, if you go and buy a super powerful wheelbase and then run it at just a fraction of its available dynamic range, you might actually get a worse driving experience than you would on a motor that's actually designed to run at the strength level that you actually want to run it at. Just like if you go and buy some massive, 1,000-watt party speaker for your garage, and then you want to listen to quiet music in the evening while the baby's asleep, you might find that the sound quality is actually terrible unless you start to crank up the volume. So it works in a very similar way with direct drive wheelbases as well. That is a simplification, but it certainly can be the case. And there are a couple of key things to understand when it comes to the actual design of a motor, which we'll get into when we get into some of the more technical stuff a little bit later on. But to move on here, we also mentioned clipping. What exactly is clipping? So clipping occurs when the input signal or amplitude or gain or volume in simplified terms fed to the motor exceeds the device's ability to actually produce the thing that is being told to produce. So again, just like a stereo system at home, if you turn the volume up too high, you'll start to get distortion through the speakers. On a wheelbase, it results in your force feedback essentially flatlining and losing all of the fidelity during the duration of the clipping event, which in practice can literally make the car feel like it's understeering mid-corner, which is obviously not a good thing, but it's also very bad for the hardware as well if appropriate countermeasures aren't in place to protect the internals. So you can imagine if you're going around a corner and you're right on the limit of the dynamic range and then suddenly it clips and it steps over, what's going to happen is the wheelbase isn't going to actually be able to produce any of that additional force. So it's just going to sit there at its maximum level, and you're not going to have any finesse, any fidelity in the wheelbase at all until it comes back under its dynamic range and then it starts to become alive again. So it actually can often feel exactly like understeer mid-corner, which is obviously not a good thing. Now, one thing that I want you to understand is that a little bit of clipping when you're in a collision or something like that is actually okay. In fact, in some cases, it can actually be a good thing, because it stops you from getting some ridiculous force trying to go through the wheel, like what we were talking about before with a real car if you were to hit a wall. But you absolutely don't want to be running into clipping at any point when you're driving around a circuit, including bumping up over curbs and things like that, because you will be losing detail and therefore your connection with the car that you're driving. So we've talked about dynamic range, how much strength you actually need, and clipping. What actually makes a good direct drive bass from the perspective of hardware and software? So to understand this, we need to go back in time a little bit over 30 years to when force feedback devices first started to become available for PCs. So we're talking back in the Microsoft Sidewinder days, for those who can remember back that far like I can. So yeah, direct input is the technology made by Microsoft, or the API, I should say, application programming interface, that was designed to handle force feedback. So essentially, it's responsible for two things: outputting a signal that the device can convert into mechanical movement to give you the force feedback that you feel through your steering wheel or your joystick, but also to provide the means for the device to feed its information back into the sim to understand exactly what it is that you're doing, so the steering position and so forth. So the reason I'm taking you back like this is because it's important to understand that when direct input was first developed, it was never intended to be something that was going to deal with, direct drive wheelbases that are mechanically connecting your hands to the motor shaft without any cogs or belts or pulleys or anything in between, which have a damping effect, which we'll get into in just a moment. It was also never intended to deal with anywhere near the kind of strength that we're dealing with in today's wheelbases as well. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we often hear referenced that the ideal way to set up your force feedback is to have minimal filters in place, because that's allowing you to feel the force feedback as the sim or the game developer intended. Now, what you need to understand is that it's absolutely impossible, particularly when you're talking about a 30-year-old technology. It's impossible for the game or sim developers to account for every single different piece of hardware that somebody might be using. The other aspect as well is that behind the scenes, even if you have the filters turned down in your force feedback settings, there's all kind of algorithmic things that are going on in the background to actually allow the wheelbase to produce anything that even resembles the feeling of a real life car, particularly when you're talking about a direct drive wheel that doesn't have any of that natural damping that you get from a belt and pulley or a cog system, as we were discussing before. So even without the filters that you actually see and can adjust yourself in the software, there's all kinds of signal processing going on behind the scenes at a software and firmware level to counteract things like, say, say, for example, oscillations in the wheel that are caused by the delay in the feedback loop between the game commands and the torque signal and the actual measured position change. So you can imagine if there's any sort of delay at all, you'll overcorrect and then it'll overcorrect the other way, and it gets into this kind of feedback loop, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced if you ever take your hands off the wheel on a direct drive wheelbase. So this baked in signal processing is why a simple firmware update can completely transform how a wheelbase feels, even if you run the filters exactly the same way as you did beforehand. And we saw a great example of this recently. We talked about it on the channel with the SimMagic Evo bases. A firmware update completely changed how that base felt at a fundamental level. And we've seen that again recently with the SimuCube 3 bases. The Moza Ultra 25 base is another great example, which we're going to be reviewing very soon here on the channel as well. So there's two really important things to understand here. Even if you're not running any filtering in terms of what you actually see in the software and can adjust in the software, there is all kinds of filtering actually going on and signal processing behind the scenes. So you need to understand that. And I hope this also kind of puts it in perspective as number 2 on that list, that often a software or firmware change can actually have a more profound impact than the difference between two completely different products. So we've often seen the case, and it's been the case with the Moza R25 Ultra, for example, while we've been testing it, that the difference between one firmware and another firmware was actually more than the difference between driving with this thing and the SimuCube 3, for example. It's that profound. So that's one of the things that makes it really difficult to review these direct drive wheelbases, and why you'll often see massive differences between what one person has said in a review and another person might have said in a review if they've not reviewed it with the same firmware and software as, again, we've seen before. So hopefully that helps you understand that this whole idea of running no filters, allowing you to feel what the game developer intended you to feel, is kind of fundamentally flawed when you understand all the things that are going on behind the scenes. So my recommendation, and how we actually test things here in the studio at Boosted Media, is that people should always start with minimal filtering in terms of what you can see in the software, and then that allows you to establish a baseline understanding of how your particular device performs, what its strengths and weaknesses might be, and then you can start to begin introducing filters to find their subjective sweet spot, adjusting one thing at a time, which is really important to establish an understanding of exactly how each filter impacts the driving experience and how they relate to each other and interact with each other in terms of driving feel as well. So you might be wondering, what on earth has all this got to do with what actually makes a good direct drive wheelbase? And hopefully it's starting to sort of make sense here that it is a combination of both the physical hardware and the software, the firmware, all these algorithms that are doing all these things behind the scenes can absolutely make or break a driving experience. So before we even discuss buzzwords like Slew Rate, Encoder Resolution, which we will get to in just a second, all you really need to know is that a quality direct drive wheelbase will always have an innate ability to produce smooth and accurate force feedback without the need to run so much filtering that you end up numbing the overall driving feel and needing to remove detail conducive to feeling what the car is actually doing underneath you. So some brands do a better job of this than others. And look, I would actually argue that this is probably the only remaining differentiator between what I would consider to be a good and a great direct drive wheelbase, if we're just talking about force feedback without getting into things like telemetry force feedback, proprietary APIs, LFE, and all those things that we're getting to in just a moment. So that's why this tends to be the focus of our review content here on the channel, rather than getting bogged down in the more technical details like measuring things like slew rate and so forth. But that's not to say that those things aren't important. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about telemetry-based effects and telemetry-based force feedback. So what is changing now with telemetry-based force feedback, and what even is that? So as we were talking about before, direct input is what's been used historically to produce all of the effects and provide the feedback loop for the sim to basically give you all the feeling that you get through the steering wheel. And direct input consists of a variety of different effects: spring, damper, constant force, and compound effects. Now, most sim racing titles these days use just the constant force effect to generate all of their force feedback. And this allows the wheel to be pushed in either direction with a force percentage anywhere within the dynamic range available, as we were discussing before. And this can be updated as many times as 1,000 times per second using the direct input protocol. So for those with an eye for detail, that is the reason why you often see manufacturers advertising things like 1,000 hertz sample rate when it comes to direct drive wheelbases. Don't tell anybody I told you this, but often the sample rate that's actually coming out of the game is a lot lower than that 1000 hertz mark. So it often is, more marketing speak type thing to make it sound like a big number rather than the reality of what you're actually feeling through the wheel. But that is something that is, for the most part at least, the same for all manufacturers, as long as they're using direct input, of course, for generating their force feedback. So as we touched on before, direct input also provides that feedback loop necessary for the sim to understand the wheel's current position so that you can actually steer the car. So this is one place where the encoder resolution can also play a role. We'll get into that in just a moment. So while direct input has historically done a good job for over 30 years now, manufacturers are starting to look for other ways to overcome its limitations. And this is done in a variety of ways, with everybody kind of fighting to have a point of difference these days. And that creates a few issues which I think we need to discuss. So back in, I think it was 2020, Logitech introduced TrueForce with their G923. Now, it was a bit of a meme at the time because, the G923 is an old style cog-driven wheelbase, which isn't really conducive to making proper use of a lot of the effects that TrueForce was actually capable of producing. But later on when they released the G Pro, suddenly it was like, oh, okay, now we understand what TrueForce is actually capable of. So TrueForce was quite unique in that it uses an application programming interface or an API developed by Logitech that actually has to be integrated into each game in order to support those effects. So Logitech being Logitech and having the massive pool that they have within the gaming industry, they did actually launch that product to their credit with a lot of games already supported by it on both consoles and PC, which was great. But you can see where this starts to become a problem. If you're relying on a third-party API to actually give you the experience that it's intended with your particular wheelbase, and that API actually has to be integrated by each game developer in order for their title to actually support those effects. Now all of a sudden, instead of game developers only having to deal with direct input as a universal standard, suddenly now they're being asked to support, maybe 20, 30 of these different APIs, which, that becomes a big task. And my concern with that is that that can result in a very inconsistent feeling on any one product between various different titles. And one of the things that we always test for in our reviews is consistency between sim racing titles, because if you've developed muscle memory for, say, a GT3 car in iRacing, and then you jump across to Assetto Corsa Competizione or Le Mans Ultimate or something like that, you don't want the car to feel fundamentally different to drive if it's the same type of car. You want to be able to retain that same muscle memory and be able to enjoy different sims without it feeling broken to you. Now, of course, different sims are going to have their subtle nuances when it comes to force feedback, and that's a topic for a whole nother video, or maybe just go watch a Gamer Muscle video on that, because he's got a lot to say about force feedback. But I'm actually really concerned about the direction this is going, with everybody wanting to have a point of difference when it comes to developing their own APIs and expecting those APIs to be integrated. Now, a perfect example of what I'm talking about here is Fanatec with their launch of Full Force. So when they released their Club Sport DD and Club Sport DD Plus 2 years ago now, there were no games that supported Full Force at all. So what that essentially meant is that you had all of your standard direct input force feedback, but all of those additional effects that are processed through their API just weren't available in any sim. And in fact, it took almost 18 months before even one title, iRacing, supported Full Force, which meant that for 18 months, the main feature that they were advertising with their wheelbases couldn't actually be used with any sim racing titles. So hopefully that makes sense. It creates a big problem if you've got 20, 30 brands all wanting game developers to integrate their APIs. So thankfully there are a couple of different ways that additional force feedback beyond just direct input can be handled. And that's what I want to talk about now. So first we've got API level telemetry based effects. And this is exactly what Logitech's TrueForce and Fanatec's Full Force are. So the core force feedback that you're feeling is still generated by direct input, but then they have a layer of effects that sits on top of that, which are basically like audio processed effects that are able to produce things like additional engine vibration, high frequency effects. So engine vibration, things like gear clunks through the steering, additional road texture, and so forth. So in general, the same kinds of effects that you can often generate through something like a vibration transducer, like a butt kicker or a haptic pad, or something like that. So rather than using generic LFE, which we'll get into in just a moment, they're using their third-party API, which needs to be integrated to generate those additional effects. And if you don't have that integration, you don't get those effects, as we see with games that aren't supported by Fanatec and Logitech's TrueForce and Full Force. So then beyond that, we're starting to see talk about API level telemetry-based force feedback, which is important to understand isn't the same thing as telemetry-based effects. So API level telemetry based force feedback means that they're completely bypassing direct input altogether and actually generating all of the effects based on their own API. So you can understand that requires an even deeper level of integration. We haven't actually seen API level telemetry based force feedback in any product up to the time of making this video, at least. Simucube are starting to make some inroads in towards that with their new Simucube 3s. They have some additional steering effects that are telemetry based, and they are planning on moving more in that direction over time. And it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes, because manufacturers are going to have to be able to support direct input and telemetry based stuff if they want to go in that direction. Otherwise, you're going to end up with games that just simply don't have any force feedback for products that, you know, don't support their telemetry if they don't also support direct input. So yeah, going to be really interested to see what happens with that. But so we touched on LFE, or low frequency effects, before. So LFE works in a very similar way to true force and full force like we discussed before, but it interfaces with the Wheelbase or other haptic devices like a vibration transducer or butt kicker, like it's an audio device. So multi-channel effects can be either generated by the game's physics, or canned effects can be triggered by telemetry based events like ABS kicking in, engine RPM, gear shifts, and so forth. So the difference there between a canned effect or game physics based effect is quite simply that a game physics type effect is going to be actually generated by the physics itself. So to use a curb strike as an example, when you hit the curb or when you're going over the rumble strip, the frequency and the vibration that you're feeling is actually based on the game's physics. So the actual texture that's mapped into that curve, if it's a laser scan track, for example. So you can imagine how that allows the game developers to be a lot more accurate in the force feedback that you feel through the wheel. But then on the flip side to that, if that detail isn't actually present in the game, then you're just not going to have any sensation of that at all. And that's one of the big things that we see in iRacing a lot. If you drive around a laser scan track, you get a lot of that road texture, a lot of that detail coming through the force feedback and through LFE based effects if you have those on your rig. But then if you drive around a track like Spa, for example, in iRacing, you'll notice that some curbs have a lot more texture to them than others do, just to give one example. And some tracks lack that detail entirely. So that's just another insight into why we choose some of the tracks we do specifically to test some of the products that you see here on the channel, and that also explains hopefully why force feedback feels a little bit different depending on the track you might be racing on from time to time in various different sims. So that is effects generated by the game's physics itself. To explain canned effects in a little bit more detail here now, basically what you're given is a trigger. So the output telemetry of the game will be car is on curb or car is changing gear. And then what it'll do is it'll tell the software, okay, we want to generate an effect that feels like a curb or feels like a gear change. And you'll notice if you go into a program like SimHub, for example, you can actually tweak how those effects feel. So when you're on a rumble strip, this is the amplitude and this is the frequency that you want to feel, and so forth. So you're able to choose what you want that to feel like rather than actually being generated by the game's physics itself. So this is, again, a lot goes into actually giving you a consistent and realistic feeling. It's not as simple as it might seem behind the scenes. So that is low frequency effects. So in essence, it achieves a very similar thing to what you have with full force and true force from Fanatec and Logitech, but it achieves it in a different way because it's not relying on a third-party API that needs to be integrated. As long as the game supports LFE effects, which iRacing does at this point in time, or you've got telemetry coming out which you can intercept with a program like SimHub to then generate those LFE effects, then you're going to be in business. So we just recently saw with the new Moza R25 Ultra and R21 Ultra, those bases actually support LFE. So you can get those kinds of effects coming through your wheel without the reliance on a third-party API. So you might be wondering, why do manufacturers use third-party APIs to do this when they could just use LFE? And the reason for that, among other things, is that LFE does have a slight delay or a slight lag compared to API integration, at least depending on how it's integrated. And also because it is treating the device ultimately as an audio device, you are limited in being able to produce multiple effects at the same time, because you don't have unlimited channels, of course, whereas with a API, it's basically down to the developer how they want to handle that. So it gives the manufacturers more granular control over that side of things, but with the limitations that we discussed. So that is LFE, or low frequency effects. It's a little bit of a misleading name because it's actually often used to deal with high frequency effects, as we were discussing, like road texture, engine RPM, and so forth. So then we get into telemetry-based force feedback, not to be confused with API-level telemetry force feedback. So with API, as we discussed, we're relying on a third-party integration to actually generate those effects. With telemetry-based force feedback, this can be handled in a couple of different ways. So most sim racing titles these days output telemetry data. Now, it's not exactly the same data that we see coming through the direct input data stream, but it can certainly be used to enhance some of those effects. So again, unlike with an API, as long as the game outputs telemetry, that telemetry can be intercepted by the Wheelbase's software and firmware and then used to generate additional effects on top of direct input, or to even replace direct input to a certain extent, again, depending on whether or not the game actually outputs the telemetry necessary to completely control force feedback. Remembering, of course, it doesn't provide that feedback loop that we were talking about before. So there's always going to be at least some level of reliance on something else in order to get the steering inputs back into the game, if that makes sense. So telemetry output is generally handled via UDP protocol, which is like a generic communication protocol, or via shared memory. Now, there is typically a 15 to 30 millisecond latency or delay involved with effects that are generated this way. So that is, again, another reason why companies may want to use an API rather than using this method. But look, that is going to be noticeable to some people, not noticeable to others. Notably, you might be aware that there are a lot of third-party apps like Marvin's iRacing app and IRFFB from a couple of years ago that actually do exactly this. So they intercept the game's telemetry, and then they use this in addition to direct input to enhance the quality of the overall force feedback. But one of the reasons I didn't get along with IRFFB is because I actually found that latency to be slightly noticeable to the point where I felt a little bit disconnected when I was driving the car. So I actually just prefer to run with the raw force feedback. So interestingly here, one brand, VNM, whose extreme wheelbase we reviewed recently, we actually are yet to review their less powerful wheelbases, but we're doing that very soon, so make sure you stay tuned for that. They've taken matters into their own hands, and they've actually started using this data to generate some of their own force feedback. Now, they've just recently introduced a really innovative thing that allows you to actually adjust the ratio with a slider between direct input and telemetry-based effects to dial in your exact sweet spot. So if you're running purely just on telemetry-based effects, you are going to have a wildly different experience depending on the sim that you're running. But if you blend it a little bit, you can actually get things dialed in pretty well. So again, this is another interesting approach. It has the disadvantages of being dependent on the telemetry that the game is actually outputting, as well as having the disadvantage of that slight latency or lag that we discussed. But it has the advantage of, again, not requiring a third-party API integration to actually be supported. So it's a lot easier for game developers to support this across the board and have every single manufacturer jump on board and use this method, rather than having to integrate every single manufacturer's own API to achieve effectively the same thing. So that's a quick explanation of what each of these new technologies are, the differences between them. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how things play out there. So what we'll do is we'll keep our direct drive buyer's guide that we showed you before updated. We'll let you know which brands are using which method over there as well, in case you're curious about that. And yeah, as we test and evaluate things moving forward, we'll keep those guides updated for you, so you're always getting the latest information, at least to the best of our ability. But at least now you understand exactly what those are, so you're armed with more knowledge to understand what exactly you're getting yourself into if you buy into any one of these ecosystems. So now that you've got a better understanding of all that stuff, let's get into some of the more technical stuff around what actually makes a direct drive wheelbase tick. So again, we are going to be talking about some software-based things, some firmware-based things, and some hardware-based things here. And this is going to give you a good general understanding of how all these things go together. So starting off with sample rate here. Now, we talked about this a little bit before. I mentioned that direct input has a maximum sample rate of 1000 hertz, but in reality, a lot of sim racing titles aren't actually able to generate their force feedback that quickly. It's often tied to the physics engine itself. So in the case of iRacing, for example, the physics engine actually runs at 60 hertz, or it's updating 60 times per second. And that means that the next packet of force feedback data is also being outputted 60 times per second. Now, iRacing specifically do a couple of interesting things to get around this and give you up to 360 hertz. But the reason why I want to talk about sample rate is because this has a very large impact on what a wheelbase will actually feel like in your hands when you're driving, based on how they handle things like interpolation. Now, interpolation is essentially creating packets of data artificially between the real packets of data. So you can imagine if you're outputting a new packet of force feedback data 60 times per second, then there's going to be slight jumps between those packets of data. You can imagine, say, for example, if you're running your sim at 120 Hertz on your displays, but the force feedback is only actually updating once per every 2 frames, then there is a little bit of a disconnect there. Now, whether or not that is perceivable is debatable. I'm going to leave that up to you guys to decide, and I'd be really interested to see your comments on that down below. But essentially what that allows is for manufacturers of wheelbases to interpolate or simulate data in between those packets. So interpolation is quite simply just artificially generated data which fills the gaps between the packets around it. So we actually saw this in TV technology about 10, 15 years ago now. You might remember a lot of new TVs were coming out, and even though the LCD panels that they were using were limited to maybe 100, 200 Hertz, they were often advertising numbers all the way up to 800 Hertz because they were using things like interpolated frames, black frame insertion, and so forth. So the reason why you might want to do this on a wheelbase is to effectively smooth things out between those packets of data. And it can, again, depending on the sim, have quite a profound impact on the overall driving experience. Now, the quality of the algorithms responsible for actually creating this interpolated data, again, is going to be a very important differentiator between different brands. So some brands have a lot more resources to do some really clever things in order to generate that data, whereas other brands will be simplifying it and literally just taking an average between 2 packets to determine what the next packet should be before it receives the next real packet of data. So very similar to what we're seeing with a lot of GPU technology these days, using AI generated frames and so forth to boost frame rate. We're able to do a very similar thing depending on the complexity offered by the manufacturer to interpolate that data. So that's one area in the software side where some brands are going to be able to do a better job with more resources of generating that data based off all kinds of different things rather than just an average between 2 packets of data. So hopefully that makes sense. So to summarize there, interpolating what the wheelbase should be doing between actual samples is tricky to get right, and some manufacturers do a better job than others. This is one of the key areas where subtle differences between brands can be quite noticeable outside of just overall strength and responsiveness. So now we start to get into the mechanical hardware side of things with slew rate. So this has become a topic of quite hot debate in recent years. Slew rate didn't really ever tend to be something that was discussed until a couple of brands started coming out with big numbers and sort of claiming that their products were better than others because they had a higher slew rate and so forth. And people have got a little bit carried away with this, at least in my opinion. So let's break it down, let's explain it. So slew rate is essentially a measurement of the maximum rate at which the motor can respond to a large change in state. So a sudden spike in force feedback, a sudden change in direction, and so forth. So in a nutshell, all other things being equal in terms of things like rotating mass and so forth, which we'll get to in just a moment, a wheelbase with a higher slew rate will provide a more lively, more reactive feeling wheel with sharper and finer detail. But there is absolutely a sweet spot here. So higher number doesn't necessarily mean better beyond a certain point. And where that point is going to be a subjective preference thing, unfortunately. So I can't give you a specific number where it's like, okay, if the wheelbase has a slew rate more than this, don't worry about it. It's just not really that simple. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But there does become a point where the motor becomes unrealistically snappy, and a higher slew rate number just doesn't mean a better driving experience. Most people end up actually capping the slew rate on a lot of high-end wheelbases for this exact reason, because it can just start to become overreactive, hyperactive, so to speak, and it's actually necessary to tame the beast by capping that slew rate a little bit lower. So to summarize there, as long as the slew rate is sufficient to allow the wheel to react to what the car is actually doing inside the sim quickly enough that it doesn't sort of desync with what the car is doing. So you can imagine if you're drifting, for example, and you have a massive transition where you're having to quickly whip the wheel around the other way. As long as the wheel is able to keep up with what the car is actually doing and doesn't start to feel disconnected, then you've got adequate slew rate there. The other area where it can play a role is, it's just in those finer, more granular details. If it's having to change direction very, very rapidly, those sort of details can feel a little bit more defined the higher the slew rate is. But yeah, if the slew rate isn't high enough, you end up feeling disconnected and you end up with sloppy force feedback. That is pretty much non-existent on any modern day direct drive wheelbase though. So it's not really a problem anywhere, and not really something that I think should be a massive point of decision making when you're choosing a direct drive wheelbase. So that is a quick rundown on slew rate. That kind of ties in with rotating mass, which is the next thing that I want to talk about as well. So look, this is pretty simple. The more mass that a motor has to deal with, the more motor strength will be required to achieve the same feel for the driver. Once again, all other things being equal. So while some weaker motors may be absolutely fine with lighter wheels, they will start to struggle to respond to what the car is doing quickly enough, as we were discussing before with slew rate, and start to feel disconnected from the car when you try to use them with a heavier wheel. So the result there ends up being numb and sluggish feeling force feedback with a lack of fine detail. Now, if you're involved in the car scene at all, you've probably heard of unsprung weight. So just like in the motorsport world where you want to reduce your unsprung weight, so your brakes, your brake disc, your wheel, your tire, and basically anything that's connected to the suspension and not the body of the car. Reducing the rotating mass that the motor's actually having to deal with will result in less effort required by the motor, and therefore, as a result, sharper and more responsive force feedback. So many manufacturers actually go to great lengths to achieve this. You might remember with Fanatec's CSL DD, for example, that being a relatively weak direct drive wheelbase at 5 Newton meters without the boost pack, or 8 Newton meters with the boost pack. They actually used a composite carbon and plastic material to create their shaft so that it's got a lot less rotating mass. That means that there's less inertia, less weight to get moving, and they can get away with having a less powerful motor while still achieving the same amount of responsiveness. So yeah, and that does come at the cost of course, rigidity and flex. So it is, of course, a little bit of a balancing act, and it does also play in with the diameter of the wheel that you're using as well. So the larger the diameter, not necessarily the more weight you have, but the more leverage you have on the motor. So the larger the diameter, the weaker the force feedback and less responsive the force feedback is going to feel overall. So if you've ever tried using a big 350 millimeter wheel on something like a Logitech G27 with a mod or something like that, you might have noticed the force feedback just doesn't feel as strong as it did with the smaller wheel. That is one of the reasons why that is the case. Now, this does tie in with what we were discussing before about a more powerful motor not necessarily being better, because you can imagine a more powerful motor is generally going to be larger and have more rotating mass. So if you're running that large motor that's designed to actually deal with that weight at its maximum strength, and then you use that motor down at the 5 or 10 or maybe 15 Newton meter range, it's actually going to be fighting against itself. And a motor that's actually designed to operate within that range may well actually feel more responsive and more powerful operating at that level. So just something to keep in mind there as well. So next up, we've got encoder resolution. This is something that we're starting to see discussed a lot more in marketing and on spec sheets. So what does it actually mean? So every single direct drive wheelbase needs to know its physical position throughout its rotation to achieve two things. Firstly, to have its own feedback loop, so it can do all sorts of things like cogging and torque ripple reduction, which we'll get to in just a second, to do its interpolation internally, like we were discussing before as well as, you probably guessed, relaying your actual physical steering inputs back into the sim so you can actually physically drive the car. So the encoder is responsible for determining the wheel's physical position throughout its rotation. So a direct drive wheelbase is actually mechanically able to rotate infinitely in either direction, and the encoder is going to measure its physical position through that 360-degree rotation, and then it'll basically use a multiplier in each direction. And generally speaking, most wheelbases these days can go past 2,000 degrees of rotation to account for things like truck sims where you're going to be going like that with the steering wheel a lot. But the actual resolution of that encoder does play an important role. So the higher the resolution, the more points of measurement it has throughout a 360-degree rotation. And you'll usually see encoder resolution listed in bits. So you'll often see 16-bit or 20-bit, 24-bit, and so forth. Now, those numbers don't sound all that different from each other, but there is actually a massive, monumental difference between them. So to give you a couple of numbers, to throw a couple of numbers out there, a 16-bit encoder has a resolution of 65,536. So that means it's able to measure 65,536 individual points throughout a 360-degree rotation, which sounds like a lot, but a 24-bit encoder is actually able to measure 16.7 million points individually around a 360-degree rotation. So manufacturers will of course argue that having a higher encoder resolution allows for finer control of the force feedback overall. And that is absolutely true. Whether or not it's actually noticeable to the driver is debatable. So 65,000 points of resolution around a 360-degree rotation is already a lot, but I would be lying to you if I didn't say that, at least in my perception, the wheelbases that we've tested that have higher encoder resolutions tend to be the ones that feel a little bit smoother, and that makes sense when you think about exactly what we've just described. So when you think about the fact that it's using its measurement to do things like interpolation, do things like processing of effects and filters and so forth, as well as relaying that back into the sim, the actual steering input part of it is only a very small part of the picture. And I don't think that anybody would be able to feel the difference between 16-bit and 24-bit in terms of the actual steering input. But when it comes to actually processing the force feedback, working with all the feedback loops, working with all the filtering and things like that, that is where it can actually play a significant and noticeable, in my experience, role. So a higher encoder resolution is technically better, but there will of course be a point where it just becomes completely imperceivable, essentially. Where that point is, I'll leave up to you to decide. But at least now you understand that is the role that encoder resolution plays. So the last technical thing that I want to talk about here before we wrap things up with some final thoughts is cogging and torque ripple. Now this is something that you used to hear discussed all the time in comparisons between direct drive wheelbases many years ago when they were kind of in their early stages. Back then, a lot of manufacturers were using just simple off-the-shelf motors that weren't really designed for the purpose of sim racing and were designed for applications where this kind of thing just didn't really matter. So what exactly is cogging and torque ripple? So what it is in terms of what you feel when you're driving is a slight sensation of notches when you rotate the wheel. So the wheel kind of feels like it wants to jump by a couple of degrees and you feel kind of weak and hard spots as you go around the rotation. Now, what's actually happening behind the scenes there is the way an electric motor works, regardless of whether it's an axial flux motor, an in-runner, an out-runner. And we're not going to get into different motor types in this video because I don't feel like it really plays a massive role in what you actually feel in terms of the driving experience these days. But we can do a separate video on that if it's something that you're interested in. Let me know in the comments down below. But regardless of the motor type, all electric motors rely on electrified coils passing through an electromagnetic field to produce their movement. And this by nature means that there will be variations in that magnetic attraction as the motor shaft rotates. So the way a motor works internally is you've got a series of magnets and coils and the motor actually has to rotate past those fields. And the larger the magnets are, the bigger the jumps are going to be in between those. This is a very, again, a simplification here, but you get the idea of what's going on here. So this results in that sensation of cogging or torque ripple as we were discussing. So more expensive motors will minimize this at a hardware level by increasing the pole count. So they'll have smaller magnets, more magnets throughout the rotation, so the jumps in between them are smaller and the magnetic fields per magnet don't need to be quite as strong. Whereas cheaper wheelbases, obviously they're trying to cut costs. So you're gonna have bigger jumps and you're gonna have more of that kind of effect. Now this can also be mitigated to an extent at least through software and firmware, which sounds kind of crazy. How on earth can you overcome a magnetic field with software? So the way they do it in simple terms is they actually vary the amount of power being outputted by the motor as it rotates through each individual magnetic field to overcome that sensation. So a lot of wheelbases, after you've updated the firmware, they'll actually ask you to run through a calibration sequence where you'll see the shaft of the motor will rotate through 360 degrees in either direction. That's exactly what it's doing here. It's actually mapping those magnetic fields. It's mapping the resistance that is pulling against the shaft, and then it uses that map to actually calculate how much power it needs to give you through the wheel to overcome that sensation and give you a smooth rotation. So again, this is another one of those filtering things, these algorithm-based things that's going on in the background without you even knowing about it. And look, these days, manufacturers actually do a pretty darn amazing job of achieving this. It's quite often that we'll pick up a new wheelbase, we'll try to turn the motor shaft and we'll just spin it freely without it being energized, and it can actually feel quite notchy in its rotation. And then you switch it on and suddenly that just completely disappears and you're kind of going, what the hell, how did that work? That's how it works. But one important thing to keep in mind there is that any time that the motor's magnetic field is actually being used for anything other than generating force feedback, it is taking fidelity, at least to some extent, away from the force feedback. Again, it's kind of like an audio system. If you've got one speaker that is responsible for delivering the entire dynamic range of the music that you're listening to, you'll notice that every time the bass hits on that speaker and the cone's going crazy, it actually slightly pulls away from the fidelity in the high frequency and mid-range sounds. And that's why you'll often see a speaker use a woofer for the low frequency, a mid-range for the mids, and a tweeter for the high. So it actually separates those so they're not affecting each other. So just the same, if you're trying to do anything with the wheelbase underneath the force feedback, it is going to mean that it has a slight impact on the motor's ability to produce other effects. Now, whether or not that's something that you actually notice when you're driving, again, it's debatable. It does depend on the base. Some of the really early direct drive wheelbases, they did feel quite numb. And I think that may well be part of the reason why that was the case, among a lot of other things, of course. So it's just another thing that makes up some of the reasons why one brand's 15 Newton meter direct drive wheelbase might be more expensive than another one's, and so forth. Another thing that plays in to the overall build quality at a mechanical level. So there you have it, guys. Now you have a much better understanding of what's actually going on behind the scenes when it comes to direct drive wheelbases, and hopefully you're now armed with a lot more knowledge to go in and choose the right one for your specific needs. So we'll of course have a written version of this video available for you guys. I'll link it down below so that you can go back and revisit anything that we've discussed today. I know I do tend to talk a little bit quickly, so if you learn better that way, then that will be available for you. We do of course have our direct drive buyers guide, as we discussed before, where we're going to relate all the things that you guys have learned today back into how it relates to each individual brand. And that'll give you a much better understanding of which particular brands will suit your needs. But the main thing that I want you to understand here is that, while all of this stuff is important, it's important to understand this. At the end of the day, there aren't massive differences in the overall driving experiences at any particular price point in the market. And look, my opinion is that things like what the software is actually like to use, what the ecosystem is like, what other peripherals they sell, how many wheels are available, whether you can easily and cheaply use other third-party wheels, or whether you have to spend a lot of money for every single wheel you have to make it compatible with that particular wheelbase. Those are the things that are ultimately going to be most important when it comes to choosing the right direct drive wheelbase for you. So head on over to our direct drive buyer's guide where you'll find all of that information. And yeah, guys, happy racing, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.